Oké, fáilte gach duine dtí trasna tír an seánnacht, Tá míad a ráis ríist le léocht eile díomhar fad thásúil an bhuiisce léir slán san áit na bhfuil sibh agus bhuiil sibh tuair airdíobh féinnig agus bhuiil sibh réibh just chun sí siarnis agus bhuair sciáil ligad agus éist go le léocht an céad scó Enda O'Flaherty. So you're very welcome here. Trusting it here again one more night. We're here with another fine lecture for you all here from the fantastic Enda O'Flaherty, who is an archaeologist, but not only that, is also an incredible photographer. So Enda has joined both of those two things together in creating this project of Ireland's disused schoolhouses and the abandoned schoolhouses. Enda also has a book that's available from Eason, and it's well worth picking up. I have a copy for myself. His images and his photography alone are incredible. Enda himself hails from Galway. He's living in Cork, so he's pre-recorded the lecture for us tonight, which I'm very grateful to him for, because he's put in a lot of work in order to get it to us by means of driving up close to a phone mast. So there's a lot of work gone into it on Enda's behalf, and I'm very appreciative for that. But he's come up with a fantastic project tonight for us all to enjoy. But what I want to do just before, and Enda's given me his permission to do, is just to show you some of his images, because in the pre-record you don't get to see all of the images. So what I'd like to do is just share quickly a screen with you from the gallery of Enda's photograph. So there we can all see we're looking at roughly the same thing there, I hope. So Enda's photography and this particular project, you can see just how talented he is as a photographer, but not only that, as an archaeologist. He's not only in every photograph capturing the architecture of the building, but he's also capturing the essence and the fabric and the story of the building. And that's what Enda does so well with this project, is that it would be very easy with these disused and abandoned schoolhouses to just look at them as an old structure. But Enda goes far beyond that, and he actually manages to capture the essence of the building and the story in the community behind the building. So here we see, and I'm going to go through them quickly just to give you a flavour. All of these images are a reflection of what's in his book, well worth picking up. Whitty Island here, 1887 in Cork. Again, we're following through here with Whitty Island, also looking here with the interior, with the chair and the classroom interior. So you can see most of the way in which these buildings have been left, and has managed to capture just the essence of the actual building themselves and the structure of the building. Again, through here, Whitty Island, and then coming into Carmore in Cork again. And then here we have Master Geehy NS and Kerry from 1870 to 1890 in the classroom interior. Moving along then again in Monaghan, we have Kilmarley from 1850. And here we have Carrigan, County Cavan in 1897, which is the interior of the schoolroom. Again, you can see the beauty of these images, not only in terms of Enda's photography, but also the actual essence of the building themselves. And in tonight's lecture, Enda's going to speak to you about each individual plan of these schools, and also what it meant to the community in terms of the story of the area and why these buildings have fallen into disrepair. So the importance of Ireland's history in terms of education is something that's not talked about or really explored in any great way or form, but Enda has actually managed to go from the beginning of this, why all of these buildings are now sitting the way that they are, and the story. So that's to give you a flavour of some of the types of schools that Enda will be dealing with in his presentation tonight. So like I said to you, it's a pre-recorded presentation. So what I'm going to try and do now is I'm going to try and jump across to Enda himself. If we can manage to get that way, we'll try and hopefully get straight onto Enda here, and you can all have a nice listen. And hopefully we can all hear what Enda has to say for the night here. So hopefully this is coming across loud and clear to you all.
Hello everybody, and you're very welcome to this presentation this evening, hosted by Trasna Chira and Kells Historical Society. And they've been very kind to ask me, my name is Enda O'Flaherty, to come along and speak to you this evening about a project that I have been running called the Disused Schoolhouses of Ireland project. Hopefully this all goes off without a glitch. I had plans to have a nice big camera in here and a nice kind of setup, and have my little presentation down in the corner. But technically it proved beyond me, so we've come up with this little setup here to try and get us through the evening. So as I said, my name is Enda O'Flaherty. I'm an archaeologist, and I'm based in Cork City. And over the last probably about 5 or 6 years now, I think. I've been involved in a little project that I created for myself, as I said, called the Disused Schoolhouses of Ireland project. And I've basically been going out and photographing, recording old schoolhouses in the Irish countryside. And I've collected those works together. There's a little book that I put out last year, and I also run a blog, endaoflaherty.com, where you can find a lot of material that I'm going to talk about tonight if you want to have a look at other schoolhouses. So without further ado, we'll get on with the presentation. So this evening, what I want to talk about, I'll give a little kind of background to the project. What is the project about? A brief history of the schoolhouse and education in Ireland, very brief. Then maybe we might discuss why there are so many abandoned schoolhouses scattered across the rural Irish landscape. We might talk a little bit about architecture and meaning. Maybe we might discuss about what makes a building important, if these buildings should be preserved or if they're special in any way. And then maybe a little bit about place, space and memory, and contributions to the historical narrative. So I hope you can all see that. I think I have it set up okay, that it should be in view. So what is this project about? Well, as I mentioned in my introduction, I've been photographing and documenting disused schoolhouses scattered across the rural Irish. The project began kind of by accident. I've been out and about in the course of field work and just touring around the country, and I kept on seeing schoolhouses, old schoolhouses, abandoned schoolhouses, scattered across the landscape, and I had my camera with me, so I started taking photographs of them. And after a while I thought, well, they're making an interesting project, I might put them up online. And so I started a little blog of the schoolhouse that I'd photographed, and made a little bit of kind of research of the individual buildings. And it started to gain a little bit of attention, and a lot of people started to come forward, and they would provide little anecdotes about the schoolhouses, ones that they were associated, ones that they knew and that they had attended. And slowly kind of a historical narrative, a kind of almost like an open source historical narrative started to be generated. So we had the buildings themselves, the brick and mortar, and then we had the people who attended them, who were kind of narrating what the building was about. And so what I tried to do is kind of synthesize this research. So looking at the architectural details, I started to categorize the different architectural designs and kind of put them in chronological order, but then also wanted to collect the stories that were associated with the buildings by local people who had attended them. I found that by placing the information online, particularly the photographs, it was quite stimulating for people to come forward and kind of fluff out the narrative of each of the individual buildings. So that's what the project is about. It's kind of a pet project. It didn't really begin from an academic kind of background. It was a pet project, something I was kind of engaged in at weekends. It was a good way to see the country as well. You ended up in a lot of interesting places, particularly along the western seaboard. That's something we'll discuss shortly. The location of these buildings, so they're not evenly scattered around the countryside. They're predominantly on the western seaboard, from Donegal down as far as Kerry. These are just some images that I've taken. One on the left is Bunanadden in County Sligo. The central one there, Drummer Temple National School in County Roscommon, and Shanavahara in County Mayo. All three of those are located on the west coast. So this is just an example of the kind of images that we were gathering and putting up online, and the people would see and would engage with, and and talk about and tell us about the buildings themselves. Okie doke. So I suppose we start at the start. A brief history of the schoolhouse and education in Ireland. So, as I'm sure most of you are probably aware, the penal laws enacted in Ireland between approximately 1695 and 1782 greatly limited the amount of education that the general population could get. And as a consequence of this, many hedge schools were founded. These were kind of informal. It was an informal kind of school system. The name suggests that they took place in hedge schools, but quite often this wasn't the case. That any building at all that could probably accommodate children or a classroom could be used, and even though they were strictly speaking against the law, quite often the law was turning a blind eye to them. And yeah, so they're occurring in across the country, quite often educating the Catholic population, as the penal laws were basically to penalise mostly the Catholic population in Ireland. It kind of
No, I don't
restricted
know what I
education. But this was kind of the status in Ireland up until about 1782. With the repeal of the penal laws, we begin to see a more formal education system becoming available for the general population. Important to this is social reform and education, the late Georgian, early Victorian period. So this is part of a broad kind of spectrum of reforms associated with this period. Reform of incarceration, and reform of education, and what we get associated with this then is between 1806 and 1812 a commission of inquiry into the state of education is formed, and this is basically just an attempt to make an assessment of what education is like both in England and Ireland. They're basically one country at the time. And this commission produces a series of reports. These reports were quite important. It's from these reports that we get the 1831 National School Act. And this is when schoolhouses begin to be funded and constructed in both England and Ireland. This is really our starting point. Because this is where most of our buildings that we look at come from, or date from after 1831. There are, of course, schoolhouses established before this. Quite often religious orders were involved in the establishment of schoolhouses, even wealthy landowners who, as part of that late Georgian effort to reform, they quite often would have funded schoolhouses in their locality. Infrequently, but it did happen. But after 1831, the National School Act creates a system whereby schoolhouses can be constructed, and the key element of this, with the 1831 Act, we get a kind of a formalisation of the curriculum, but more importantly for people is the 1831 Act establishes a system whereby the building of schoolhouses can be funded. And the method of funding was that if you could generate 50% of the cost of building a schoolhouse in your locality, the rest of the cost could be funded by the there's the dogs there. The rest of the cost could be funded by government. As part of this, then you would receive plans and architectural drawings from the Office of Public Works. It was an enormously successful programme. As you can see from the figures, by 1900 there had been 8,700 national schools constructed with 746,000 pupils in Ireland. That's in the island of Ireland. So you see that there is a massive explosion in the interest an interest in the importance of education at this time. And associated with this is the construction of so many rural schoolhouses. By 1922, the Free State, when it's established, inherits this school system. It modifies the curriculum, of course, mostly to accommodate the Irish language. And then by 1947, we see an effort to modernise kind of schoolhouse construction. So if you think that the first schoolhouses being built by the OPW under the guidance of the OPW in 1831, those schoolhouses varied a little bit in design, but not greatly, and it's probably not till about 1947, the arrival of Basil Boyd Barrett, an architect and civil servant for the OPW. He begins a program of modernising of schoolhouse design. He's quite key. And that's kind of a brief history of things. It'll give us a little bit of background into the buildings that we're looking at and the kind of social background they came from. Okay, so just I'll lean forward here and see what I'm looking at. Okay, look, we have two architectural drawings that were retrieved from the OPW archives. They're just interesting in, let's see, the one to the left is North Yard National School in County Roscommon, dating to 1869. The one to the right is Derryneen in County Galway. They're examples of the kind of plans that you would have received from the OPW once you had applied to have your national school built. You'd raised your 50% of the funding, they'd granted the other 50% of the funding. And I think they're important because it kind of explains how if you're in County Cork and you'll come across a schoolhouse, an abandoned schoolhouse maybe, and it'll be identical in design and form to one that you might find in Donegal. And the reason is because all these plans are coming from one centralised place, from the Office of Public Works. In these drawings you can see some of the kind of classic features. The one on the left-hand side there, North Yard, includes the outhouse at the back. This guy here. So they would have been dry toilets, nothing particularly fancy for students. You can see that there's a dividing wall here that would have divided the schoolyard for boys and for girls, because that was, of course, of the utmost importance at the time. And that's a two classroom schoolhouse. Is it worth? Yeah, it's worth mentioning at this point that the need was locally for small 1 and 2 room schoolhouses that children could basically walk to, and they served quite a small kind of catchment area. So you see from the previous slide that by 1900 there was 8,700 schoolhouses in Ireland. There's less than that now. I think there's only roughly about 5,000. So the number of schoolhouses has actually gone down since 1900. But what you're having is consolidation of these small schoolhouses and building of large multi-classroom schools, particularly from the 1960s onwards. So that kind of slightly explains why there's so many of the abandoned small schoolhouses located around Ireland, which is something we'll touch on shortly. Okay. So two images here from Shanavahara in County Mayo. The one on the left is it looks like a single room, but it's actually, well, it is one room, but it was divided into 3. So there were 3 classrooms in here with sliding frames that came across. So it was separated, a single room into 3 classrooms. This particular schoolhouse was built in 1935. It's probably one of the last. It's among the last ones that are kind of built to the style. The style is more Victorian. more influenced by Victorian architecture. These are the dry toilets at the rear of the of that particular schoolhouse. As I said earlier, they're nothing fancy. Would have been quite cold, I'm sure, in the winter time, and stunk to high heavens, undoubtedly. So what changes? Well, probably the most influential figure in schoolhouse design in Ireland was Basil Boyd Barrett. He was an architect for the OPW from about the 1940s onwards, and he was not just an architect. Really, he had a lot of he placed a lot of importance in understanding buildings and how buildings functioned, and he was very eager to move away from the Victorian model of schoolhouse design. He looked a lot at space and how it was used and what was important for the importance of schoolyards and proper ventilation, high ceilings, light, and all the things that we kind of associate with modern school buildings, the high windows, the high ceilings, and we really wanted to improve the environment in which education took place. But it was the 1940s in Ireland when he began his work. And as I'm sure you're aware, there wasn't a lot of money floating around in the economy at the time. So he had to... Oh yeah, I'm doing this now at the moment. Yeah, sorry about that. So there wasn't a lot of money floating around in the economy in the 1940s. So we had to keep a few things in mind. One was cost, and also the designs that he came up with needed to be repeatable, generic repeat designs. So not really shouldn't let this take away from the kind of groundbreaking work that he did, even though it sounds terrible, generic repeating designs. He managed to come up with basically a design that could be functional, probably not particularly aesthetically pleasing, but incredibly cheap and incredibly easy to construct around Ireland. Here we have probably one of my favourite schoolhouses. This is Ballymcgilligot in National School in County Kerry, built in 1955. There's an image of it there on the left-hand side. It's flat roof. It's quite modern looking, and it has that kind of, the basis of it is that generic repeating design. It's actually just a single room schoolhouse, which is unusual. Well, it's not unusual, but by 1955 these were starting to go out of fashion. So it's probably amongst the last kind of single classroom schoolhouses to be built. It has a lot of the classic features of the Basil Boyd Barrett design. You have the play shelter here out to the front, which is here. Nice little turnabout here to accommodate, I guess, people were beginning to drop children off at school maybe at that point, maybe not, but it does seem to accommodate some sort of traffic flow. It has a water tower at the back you can't see, and it's clearly just quite a different design to what was preceding it, which were basically variations on Victorian schoolhouse design. This drawing is his first drawing of the schoolhouse. It's actually, he drew it on the back of a napkin apparently. So it's quite a nice little archival piece to have. Some of his features, so yeah, key I suppose really. You'll notice that there are no outdoor toilets, and Boyd Barrett didn't really want, this was, you couldn't be having this at this point. So I'm sure what children loved is that he constructed indoor toilets, and he also included heating, central heating, rather than what preceded it, which was solid fuel fireplace, which was pretty ineffective. So you can imagine this is quite a step forward from what was basically a Victorian design that preceded it. Some more examples of Basil Boyd Barrett schools. It's a nice image here of the play shelter. This is in Glensall, Greenon in County Mayo. This is you're up in the Partry Mountains. I think it's quite isolated. It's quite far away from anywhere, and this kind of precast concrete really sticks out in the landscape. There's barely any houses around here for miles. The place is completely depopulated now at this point. Well, very few people living there. But you can imagine when this building was constructed in Glensall in the 1950s, that it was would have been quite imposing and would have looked nothing like the vernacular architecture that was in the area at the time. The bottom example there is, I think it's Carroll Priory in County Sligo. In that image you can see the water tower at the rear, and that was another feature of Basil Boyd Barrett schools, those water towers. So when you see national schools in the countryside or even in urban landscapes with those water towers, you know that they've been designed by Basil Boyd Barrett. So we kind of touched on this. Why are there so many abandoned schoolhouses in the rural Irish landscape? So as we said, in 1900 there were 8,700 national schools in operation. Today there's about 5,000 roughly. I'm not 100% sure of that figure, but it's approximately 5,000. Ireland through the 19th and most of the 20th century, really not until the programme for reform in the 1960s, was not an industrialised country, largely a rural population. And because of that, there was a requirement for small local national schools. We see that in 1840 we had a population of about 6.5 million. In the Republic by 1960 we had 2.8 million. So to put that in context, we have a significant rural population, not very much based in the urban landscape, but the population is dwindling over about 80 years there. So a combination of these factors, less and less people requiring schooling, although that's a little bit nuanced, I'll explain that, and people being quite isolated, necessitated lots of small schools. I say it's nuanced because a lot of the depopulation was due to emigration. So you still had quite young school-going populations up until probably about the 1900s and 1920s that would have required education before they emigrated, basically. Quite young, often at the time, 14 or 15 years old. So they still required schooling. They still required local schooling in small schoolhouses. But the demographics are changing. People begin, particularly from probably about the 1960s onwards, you really start to notice it. You see people moving from rural landscapes to urban centres, Dublin, or if you're in so maybe Cork or some of the larger cities. There's a movement away from the rural landscape, and there's also a change in the requirements of people. Transportation and transport infrastructure becomes greater. There's less and less need for smaller local schoolhouses, and so what you're having is a situation where small schoolhouses are either closed or several of them are combined into one. You get these consolidated schoolhouses, and with a larger catchment area, and so the buildings that these schools occupied were shut down, and this begins in probably about the late 60s, 70s, 80s into the 90s, and And the buildings are basically just left to go to rack and ruin, and that's where I come along and find these abandoned buildings in rural locations, and start to photograph them. Let's see. I mentioned just in the introduction that they're predominantly located along the western seaboard, more or less. So what we're talking about is areas that have been most greatly impacted on by immigration and depopulation. So that's basically the western seaboard, but also along the border region as well, particularly with the establishment of the border between the north and south of Ireland. It has a great impact on the people that live there, and it basically causes a lot of depopulation. So areas along Cavan, Monaghan, Leitrim as well up there. So this is where you'll find most of your abandoned rural schoolhouses in Ireland, and less so on the east coast. So not particularly in Dublin, Kilkenny, Kildare, Wexford. Less impacted on by immigration. I hope this kind of explains a little bit why there are so many and why they are located where they're located. We're getting heavy depopulation in areas along the western seaboard, schools closing down, and where there are people remaining that need to be educated, where there are children remaining that need to be educated, they're going to larger schools that cover a wider catchment area, and the original buildings are left. Just some more images there for you. I think these are from, two of them are from the borderlands, and one is from Massageehee in County Kerry, so way out on the Evora Peninsula. A lovely place if you ever get the chance to visit. Killymarley in County Monaghan, and Latin in County Monaghan also. Nice examples of ruined landscapes, I suppose, really. So maybe something else that we might talk about is architecture and meaning, and public contributions to the historical narrative. So in humanistic geography, space and place is a theme that quite often comes up. Space being the physical environment where things happen, like a building, and place being a space that's associated with an event and with meaning. And the reason that this is important, I think, is because quite a number, if not the majority, of these national schools that I photographed are not they're not afforded any specific protection as architectural under their architectural merit. Like we mentioned with Basil Boyd Barrett, they're generic repeat designs, and for that reason they're probably not viewed as kind of special in the landscape. But they are special to people who live in those localities and people who attended those schools. And there's a lot of meaning and association excuse me, wrapped up in the crumbling walls of these buildings. But there are problems, I guess. And one of the main problems, I think, is with the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, which is a fantastic resource and some excellent work done. But it's not quite homogenous because it was carried out on a county-by-county basis, and individual counties had different criteria for the buildings that they wanted to include in them. And for this reason, you'll find schoolhouses with, say, in Mayo, that are recorded in the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, and you might find an identical example in another county, Cork or Kerry or anyone really, that is identical in form and function, but is not recorded in the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage. And that's just down to the different criteria that the different county councils had set out for their recording of their county inventory. But what it means really is that there's kind of a hodgepodge of schools that have some protection and schools that don't have any at all. So the question is, are the schools important? Are the buildings themselves important? And as we mentioned, space and place, perhaps as a space, as an architectural feature, quite often they're not. There are some that are quite ornate, particularly the earlier ones from before the 1831 National School Act. But after that, a lot of them are repeat designs, and that came from the Office of Public Works. So quite often they're not viewed as valuable on their architectural merit alone. But I know that from travelling around and meeting people that attended the schools, that they are important locally. And even though the bricks and mortar might not be viewed as being of architectural value, the buildings themselves, they're buildings that almost everybody within a community would have attended and would have associations with, some positive, some negative. And for this reason, I think the buildings should be afforded some level of protection or recognition or importance, or maybe some strategy should be developed to preserve the buildings, or at least prevent them from going into any decaying any further. A view maybe to repurposing them, making them, giving them another function within a community, particularly rural communities these days who are probably feeling a little bit left out. These buildings sit quite often central within little villages and little, not even villages, little hamlets within the landscape. They would make ideal places for any gathering really at all that would be required locally. Maybe little adult education centres or anything that they could do for the community really. So that's kind of what the contribution to the historical narrative has meant for me. That these buildings were going into rack and ruin. They had no architectural value for most people. But when people became engaged with the buildings again, when they saw the photographs, when they saw the state that the buildings were in, they generated a lot of memories, a lot of stories about the buildings, and it's these memories that kind of contribute to the historical narrative of the building, and give it a value beyond its structural value or its architectural value, I think. Kind of developing on from this, so what makes a building important? Two images there. One is Hollygrove National School in County Galway, and Mealeen National School in County Cork. The one on the left, Highgrove, is really a hideous looking building. I think it's, I don't have the date, 1899. It was an awful design, probably released by the OPW for National School Design. But it is recorded in the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage in County Galway, because their criteria, I think, required for them to record all national schools in the locality or in the county. So despite it not having really any architectural merit, it's not a particularly old building, it's not an ornate building, but it is an important building within the community, and it has been recorded in the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage. Mealeen, 1914 in date, in County Cork. I don't think it is recorded in the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage. So you have two kind of examples of schools. They're not particularly interesting designs, so they probably wouldn't be considered important from an architectural perspective. But I get a lot of requests for information for Grove, particularly from people from the diaspora, from countries from the UK and from the United States, whose relatives would have emigrated. and they're quite keen to know what the landscape that their relatives came from. And besides the homestead, there's two buildings really that people associated with. One was the church, of course, and the other was the school. So for these communities at the turn of the 20th century and a little bit further on, these are among the central spots that they would have interacted with within their community before they would have left. And I think that makes building important. Even though, like, Holygrove is not a particularly attractive building, it's central to what happened in the landscape within the community through the 19th and 20th century. And for that reason, I think it makes the building important. Okay, that's probably enough about that. Just some images here. It's a very nice image of Ballycastle National School in County Mayo. Lovely blues on the wall, lovely red on the chimney breast. As I mentioned earlier on, this was a kind of a ubiquitous, the chimney, the fireplace was a ubiquitous feature of National School design up until the arrival of Basil Boyd Barrett. Solid fuel brought by the children, and the fireplace was located at the top of the classroom, so it really didn't benefit anybody but the teacher. But the children were required to bring the quite often turf to the school every day as fuel for the fire. More features of these national schools. This is Shanavara. I think we've seen this image earlier. The sliding screens would have come across here. So, although it's one single room, it was actually 3 individual classrooms. So we're kind of coming to a point where I might try and sum up what I've been trying to do here. So photographing the disused schoolhouses scattered across the Irish landscape. As I said, it started out as a pet project, and mostly photographing and recording the buildings just as almost like a pastime, really. But as I put them online and as people began to see the images, they were quite evocative images for people, just to be reminded of what the buildings were like. I think a lot of it was to do with strong memories are generated when you're quite young, and these buildings are places that are associated. The children would have engaged with them when they're quite young. Those memories stay with you for quite a long time. And I think to see the buildings in ruin and different to how they are remembered in the present can kind of stimulate quite a strong response. And I think that probably helped to bring out the narrative and made people want to talk about what they saw in the photographs and what they thought of what they saw. I have a little piece I wrote there. Contemporary ruins can provoke an unusual emotional response that is difficult to define. A familiar environment that has fallen into decay can be both unsettling and intriguing, inspiring fascination and fears as a tangible reminder of the scale of your own lifetime. That's quite heavy, but it's just an interesting observation of what it's like to ramble around these ruined buildings that I don't have a personal connection with, but when I introduce those images to other people, the strong emotional response that people can have to seeing these buildings that they've associated with their childhood. Memory is a dynamic and fluid, a pulsing, living thing. It can be continually stretched, coveted, erased, and manipulated by the environment and circumstances from which it is recalled, taking on greater or lesser significance that is determined by the interpretation of those who recollect it in the present. So again, that's quite heavy, but again, it's just an observation of memory and the functions of memory and the kind of the dynamic nature of it as well, that is not consistent, that you can change through time and how you remember places. And I think that's probably one of the things I learned most from this project, is that engaging with people's memories is quite rewarding, and their contributions to the historical narrative. I think that was probably the most important part, that if they hadn't engaged with the buildings and with the photographs, then the narrative that was associated with the buildings would have been lost. And as we discussed earlier, the buildings themselves are not considered to have any particularly strong architectural merit. So they basically just vanish. And what vanishes with them is all the associations and all the community ties with the buildings. And again, that's another argument to say that maybe something should be done, and some effort should be made to preserve the buildings, or have the community re-engage with them, and preserve not just the physical structure but the memories associated with them. That's about it, really. I hope you enjoyed it. You can get me on Twitter, Ena81, on Twitter at Ena81. There's a Facebook page as well, if you want to follow that. And I haven't been posting much up online over the last 6 months or a year or so, but I've just started to re-engage with it, and I have a few ideas for a few more projects that I would like to do, so hopefully they'll come to fruition over the next year or two. So do check out the Facebook page. It's probably a convenient way to kind of keep up to date with what I'm doing, and of course there's the website as well, www.endaoflaherty.com. And that is it, and I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe a little bit brief, but thank you to Trosna and Cheerna and Kells Historical Society, and have a good evening, and I hope you're getting through the COVID-19 crisis okay. And keep an eye on Trosna and Cheer's Facebook page as well, because there's some great talks coming up over the next while. Okie doke, thanks very much. Bye bye.
Okay, so that was Enda O'Flaherty there, from all the way from Cork, speaking to us there about Ireland's disused schoolhouses. Again, great thanks to Enda for all the effort he went to actually get it there to us, because he had to make a few trips to a phone mast to get that lecture to us. Briefly, before I let you all go, I know you're all willing to have a cup of tea there. I just want to bring you back again just to these images that I spoke about at the start. Now, these, again, well worth checking out. If you want to get in touch with Enda, he's more than willing to take emails off people. If you think there's a school maybe in your locality that you might like get something to be looked into, one of the disused schoolhouses, Enda is very much willing to take any emails or anything, that if you want to get in touch with me, more than happy to answer your questions. But again, looking at these images, when Enda speaks of that sense of space, place, community, that's the thing that really Enda has captured with this project. It's not just about the architecture, it's not just about the fabric, about the building, it's the narrative, like he says, the sense of space and community and place that he's captured not only in these incredible photographs, but also in the research and in the way he's engaged with the community. You can pick up one of his books, again, from Eason. I think you can see it there. There you can pick it up. Well worth the images alone and the research. It's a fantastic amalgamation, and he's due some great credit for keeping that story alive for what otherwise would have fell into rack and ruin. So from Trosna Tíre tomorrow night, if you're looking to engage again, the Cistercians of Medieval Ireland by Dr. Breda Lynch is there for you at 8 o'clock on the same Zoom platform. And then following that on the 30th, we have Kilkenny's Great War Work Commandant Larry Scallon. Again, two fantastic lectures coming along. We have a lecture pretty much every single day, all the way up to the end of May, just about. So I definitely think it's an achievement. And these times, I don't think we would have been hearing these fantastic stories from every single part of the countryside. So I'd like to thank you all very much for tuning in. Thanks for taking the time. Take care, stay safe. Agus tóg me agus búil mí liver ríist, tuair ara slán.